Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It's a pleasure to welcome to the program Nathan Tankus. He is the research director of the Modern Money Network. Here to Nathan, I appreciate your coming on the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
You've been, I know that what you were doing prior to COVID-19 had to do with looking into the sort of the monetary policy that would be behind a Green New Deal. You shifted over to talking about the response, the Fed's response to COVID-19. I don't know what we would call this from an economic perspective, but the fallout from a pandemic, I guess. And I know that you're not an economist per se, but your research on this has been, you're getting quite a bit of acclaim for the work you're doing, and you're used to speaking to people who are very well versed in economics. Well, today you're going to elementary school for the rest of us. But before we get there, let's start with why don't you just tell us what the Modern Money Network is, and just tell folks about like the post-Keynesian, school of thought of money.
Yeah, sure. So the Modern Money Network is a nonprofit, a 501c3 that's focused on education around money and economics, especially the interrelations between economics and law from a kind of macro perspective, looking at money, looking at employment, looking at price stability, focusing on these kind of big macroeconomic issues, and education around money that there tends to be not very much around. Like money is kind of subject that we live our whole day talking about, but it's the mechanics of it, how it works in the plumbing behind the scenes isn't something that is necessarily taught at any level, all the way down from elementary school, high school, all the way up to undergraduate, law school, graduate school. And the Modern Money Network started at Columbia Law School as a way of generating education around money and finance, and thinking that money and macroeconomics was something that was important for everyone to know about, but especially the people who essentially design the system, lawyers.
Right. And the idea being that, I guess more, sort of lay people on some level, or theoretically, the thing that we see a lot is where people just freak out and say they're printing money out of thin air, as opposed to what?
Yeah, exactly. There's a perpetual shock at how the system works at a very basic level. And, I think that, we have so little literacy around money that, if you ask a lot of people, about half of them would think that the money that is out there is backed by a bunch of gold at Fort Knox. And the more you probably get more education about how money works, like from Bond movies, than you do in any other part of your life. And that's, not exactly a great education in terms of how money works. And so we have these perpetual forgetting, and then every crisis, suddenly there's a lot of attention on what the Federal Reserve is doing and what Congress is doing. And suddenly there's this sudden realization and all these questions around these issues, and then a forgetting. And the Modern Money Network was founded after the Great Financial Crisis, to try to keep that flame alive and try to put out their materials on educating about money, so that people have more of a money literacy when these big crises happen.
And we should say, this is associated with the modern monetary theory, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. They were all close colleagues of a set of economists, Professor Stephanie Kelton, Scott Fulweiler, and so on, and many others. Definitely associated and closely working with them, but also a focus, a little bit more of a focus on the legal side, on the legal analysis of things, and on And so, and kind of expanding out this project to be more interdisciplinary and, more deeply rooted in law.
Okay, and folks can go back, and if they Google Majority Report Stephanie Kelton, we've had her on I don't know 3 or 4 times, and we've gone through the specifics of this. It was years ago, but still obviously the same. And all right, so let's just talk about just give us a sense of what is money. I mean, for the just I get let's just start with there, and then and then we'll get into sort of what the Fed has been doing and what is new that the Fed is doing that they haven't done before, and what the implications are. But just give us this basic understanding of what money is, and go slow through the parts with the accounting.
Yeah. So at the most basic level, money is a tax credit. It's a tool that we use to settle our obligations with the government. You show up, you have a fine, a fee, or you have a tax bill. You have to pay that in something. And this is a step that's so obvious that we overlook it, but it's actually kind of everything. It's crucially important. Whatever you can pay your taxes with, makes that thing that you can pay your taxes with really valuable. You can pay your taxes with pigs. Pigs are suddenly really valuable. You can pay your taxes with chickens. Chickens are suddenly really valuable. So at this most fundamental level, money, what is money, is something that you can settle your obligations with, whether it's the court, whether it's the state, whether it's another private actor, but it's all determined by legal systems. A court says what you can pay your obligation with. A court, adjudicates, a contract dispute and says, what is an appropriate way to settle this contract between two people. So from MMT's view, from the modern monetary theory view, it's that ability to settle obligations that makes something money, or the ability to convert whatever item you have into something that you can pay your taxes with, essentially.
All
but
right.
Also fines, fees, court judgments.
So just to be clear here, in this also, and this is for my libertarian friends, this comes from an entity having a monopoly of force and saying and decreeing, this is how we're going to settle we're going to impose debts on you, taxes, and like you say, fees and other things like that from the government. And this is the only thing, or one of the things, this is what we will take to call us even here. And so without taxes, and I guess presumably fees and whatnot, but without government obligations in terms of what we must pay to the government in some fashion or another, the money we would have has no value. It becomes like a cryptocurrency, which has value only to the extent that people will buy it in the same way that like baseball cards do, or those puka shells at when you go to like a all-encompassing vacation place or something like that, and you can use it at the bar. It's only where they agree on some level, right? But in terms of universality within a society, and in certain instances outside of the society, it's just a function of what the government will take to square your debts with the government.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
it's whatever you can use to get even.
Right. And that concept of getting even becomes really important in this concept of accounting, right?
Yes. Absolutely. Because the other fundamental thing about these relations is that one entity's or person's IOU is another person's asset. So that, whether it's cash in your hand or a government security, that item is something that is an IOU. It's a debt of the government and an asset to us. It's something we hold. It's something that's worth money to us, but it's a debt to them. The difference is, our debts, don't generally have a lot of money in it. I usually can't, pay someone by just writing a Tankus IOU and saying, I love, nice, great 5-star restaurant you have. I love this meal. Here's my IOU. Enjoy that. But with the government, you essentially do have that. A government can't just emit a bunch of IOUs. It can send out checks that you get a nice little balance statement, but all that balance statement really tells you is that you have some IOUs from the government, but you're happy with that because you can pay your taxes, you can pay court judgments, and ultimately because all these sets of payments are denominated in dollars, other people who sell goods and services also accept dollars. So it's accepted everywhere.
Will you make that a government IOU? Will you make that more tangible? Like, when do we see a government IOU?
You mean, when do we first see it?
No, but I mean, when do, like in the course of our daily lives? Like what?
You open your pocket. If you open your pocket, you take out a note right now, and it will say the Federal Reserve note. It'll be signed by a Federal Reserve official and a Treasury official, and it will say that it's accepted for all obligations, public and private. At the most basic level, the physical cash in your pocket is an IOU of the federal government.
And the federal government, just like basically issues these IOUs, and they become valuable to trade because the government ultimately is going to require something of value from everybody you're giving it to or could give it to. And therefore, it never actually has to be anything other than a promise to pay, because ultimately you're paying it back to the government. And the government is like, yeah, our promise to pay, we're going to pay ourselves.
Yeah, exactly. It relies on there's this whole set of payments that you can settle in dollars, so it never has to offer you anything else. It doesn't need to offer you, we'll give you this nice shiny object if you turn it in. It gives you, we'll settle your tax bill and we won't put you in jail, or you'll be able to settle your debt with your ex-wife or whatever it is. It gives you the ability to settle whatever obligations that you encounter in the society that are court ordered and such. And that is so valuable to people. In fact, it's so valuable that we hoard it, that we accumulate as much as we can for fear of whatever future obligations or expenses that we're going to encounter in the future.
Okay. And so will you just tell us the relationship between debt and savings? Because I want to just get all these basic sort of like tenets down before we go into what the Fed is doing, because I think it'll help, to make sure that we're all on the same sort of page, as it were. Sure.
And so the corollary of all this, that, the government's IOU is our assets, is that, at an aggregate level, for every financial asset is also in turn someone's financial obligation. So as a result, when the government runs a deficit, when the government spends more than it takes in, there must be corresponding surpluses out there, whether that's households or businesses or state and local governments or the rest of the world. Someone has to be getting more dollars than they're giving up, essentially, if the federal government is deficit spending. So that's always money in someone's pocket, always increasing someone's level of financial assets when the government runs a deficit, and vice versa. And the flip side is, when the government is running a surplus, usually that means we're running deficits. So if we're spending much more than we're taking in, when the Federal Reserve, when the federal government is running a surplus, that surplus is literally taking money out of our pockets.
Okay, so all right. Now I really want to slow down even on this, and because those words, I can remember those words, and I've stated them myself, but I really want people to understand this for sure, from a conceptual standpoint. So the government borrows money, and it has debt, and it spends more than it has, right? Like how it's spending, it's not spending more than it has, because it really has an unlimited potential, I guess, right? Of money, theoretically. And it's spending more than it has because it's spending more than it's taken in from its citizenry, right? And let's just say it that way for ease, but even though the US government probably takes in money like I'm taking in fees from non-citizens, whatever. But let's just say that it's taking in, and it's spending more than it's taken in. And it's doing that by either printing the money or by just simply issuing IOUs by some other form, like, not necessarily verbal, but some other instrument that doesn't look like cash. It could be just we have an electronic IOU, and that tender is we just put it in your bank account. So boom, your numbers are up because we have a relationship with the bank. So, and that's what it means when they're spending money they don't have, that there's that much more savings on the other side, because the equilibrium is what the government takes in from its citizens and then spends it out. If it spends out, so if it takes in 10 and it spends out 10, there's an equilibrium. But if it takes in 10 and spends out 20, that extra 10 has to be somewhere. And it necessarily, if it's not with the government, has to be with the citizens.
Yeah. I mean, that at the most fun level, that's true. There's some complicated stuff with the rest of the world, but if you just take, say like there's an isolated, just take one country, forget about the rest of the world. That government spends $1,000 and collects $900 in taxes. Some person or group of people have to have collectively $100 left over. That's just, cash they have on hand or money in a bank account that they have on hand. There has to be some surplus that people have that corresponds to the federal government's deficit. And so fundamentally, if we want to accumulate financial assets, if we want to make sure that we have a bunch of savings that can protect us in a crisis, and not be so deep in debt ourselves, then then the federal government probably is going to be the one that has to deficit spend in order for there to be money in our pockets, or collectively, the corporate America and households all together, something like that has to be the case.
All right. Now I just want to go through the other way where the government has a surplus. That means that they take in $900, and instead of spending 1,000 and instead of spending 900, they only spend 800. So the government is tightened its belt, as it were. And now they have an extra $100, but that extra $100 means that there's $100 less circulating around in the private sector. And that means that people had to go into debt. Somebody had to, or maybe, everybody had to go into debt by a penny or whatever, 0.001 of a penny or something to pay their bill to the government.
They have to, absolutely. Usually they have to collectively get into more debt to pay. There's some unique time periods where people have just so much cash that the government running a surplus just takes cash out of their hands rather than putting them into debt. Like, for example, after World War II, the deficits were so big in World War II that when you had a couple periods where they ran surpluses, and when the federal government ran surpluses in the 1940s or the early 50s or whatever, what that did was just took cash that people had accumulated during the war.
There was so much slack. There was so much slack in the system that it just basically was working on slack and then ultimately tightened up. Okay. But
that slack went away over the decades. I mean, that's like one of these big conceptual points, is that we had these huge deficits during World War II where everyone essentially accumulated cash, had a bunch of money on hand, whether they were businesses or corporations. And that gave the system a lot of flexibility, times when the federal government could run surpluses and it wasn't going to cause huge problems. But over time, that period faded. We kept on having these periods where we ran relatively small budget deficits, and over time, the private sector got more and more into debt, and we reached the high private debt levels that we did eventually in the great financial crisis and after.
Okay. And so, and then one other point here, and I just want to make sure that we make a distinction between sort of tax policy, as it were, and the idea of like, of taxation, because the government doesn't need to taxed to spend money. And we've just said they can basically just issue IOUs, and that's what they do. They don't need the money to issue the IOUs. But taxing is really about making sure that the money has value. If there were no taxes and the government required no taxes and no fees from us, then all of a sudden the money would be, we would just rely on the fact that everybody agrees we're going to spend this, but then eventually people would start catching on, going like, wait a second, we don't need dollars to pay taxes. Maybe these, the Seder bills are good or whatever it is, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And we should also say that taxation is a way of you can deal with like wealth inequality or whatnot. And this is
absolutely,
and we're talking about the federal taxes here, because when we talk about state and local taxes, that doesn't have an impact. That doesn't have implications for monetary policy, because in the same way, because they're just subsidiaries of the federal government.
Yeah.
Okay.
Though the big thing I would say, though, is that state and local governments are something that the federal government has to take into account when they're deciding on their spending policy, on their tax policy, because people might look at the federal government number and be like, oh, that deficit, it's so big, but generally, usually, outside of huge crises like this, state and local governments are running surpluses, and the Federal Reserve or the federal government has to offset for that. That it has to, if the state and local governments are running surpluses, then the deficit that the federal government runs has to be even larger in order for you and I to, experience surpluses, or the businesses to experience surpluses. And that's, that's the huge problem right now, is that these, because tax revenues have collapsed across the board, state and local governments have lost all this money. They need money directly from the federal government to get them out of their fiscal troubles.
Okay, and so let's just be clear: we have fiscal and monetary policy. These are two basically. They're related, but they're not the same. Will you just make that distinction clear to people, because we're going to be talking about monetary policy as opposed to fiscal policy, right, in this conversation for the most part.
Yeah. So fiscal policy is exactly what we've just been talking about: spending and taxing. It's what gives us surpluses. If the government runs a deficit, we get a surplus, as we've just been talking about. Monetary policy is different, because monetary policy doesn't directly, affect whether people are running surpluses or deficits. Instead, monetary policy is about the terms at which they can finance their debts or finance their deficit. Monetary policy is, we're going to buy a whole bunch of government bonds to lower interest rates. Monetary policy, as we'll be talking about, is we're going to buy a whole bunch of bonds from the corporate sector to lower the interest rate that they pay and make sure they have access to finance. Monetary policy is we buy the debts of state and local governments to make sure that they lower the interest rate that they pay, and that they can find finance. But that isn't mean that they don't have, that they suddenly have a surplus when they did have a deficit. When you conduct monetary policy, when you do these purchases and sales, instead it's just affecting the financing, which is important, but it can't replace lost income. And that'll be previewing something we'll talk a lot more about, is that you can have all the monetary policy in the world, but if a company has lost a whole ton of income and has a big deficit, the monetary policy won't make that deficit go away.
Right. It might keep you afloat for a while, but at one point you're going to have to deal with it. Yeah. All right. And just to be clear, broadly speaking, Congress deals with fiscal policy, and the Fed deals with monetary policy.
Exactly.
And but there's also a relationship between the Treasury and the Fed that begins to sort of arguably blur that line a little bit.
Yeah. So I would say, I just described monetary policy as purchase and sale policy, where you purchase financial assets and you sell financial assets out there. Well, the Treasury, not when it spends or taxes or is involved in the spending and taxing process, doesn't blur those lines. But when it engages in sales, when it sells financial assets, it absolutely is blurring that line. And the big time that they do that is when they sell Treasury securities. That process where you're selling Treasury securities, and there's a whole bunch of net issuance out there, that's affecting interest rates for if they sell 10-year bonds, that affects interest rates for 10-year bonds. And the Federal Reserve has to respond. And so, if the Federal Reserve selling a Treasury security is monetary policy, then arguably, I would make the case that the Treasury doing that is monetary policy. And it leads to some complications because the Treasury thinks of its job mainly as financing federal spending, as making sure that the federal government can make its bills, and so it uses these Treasury securities to do that, because that's the main instrument outside of a couple others we could name that it can use to do that. But the Federal Reserve thinks of it as a monetary policy instrument. It thinks of it as these bonds as a way to affect interest rates, and that leads to some tension. There's been conflicts over the decades between the Federal Reserve and the Treasury over their different outlooks over how they should treat, how they should deal with Treasury securities.
Okay, so and let me just reduce this down so that I can understand it. When we say Treasury security, we're talking about generally speaking, like bonds. We're going to borrow money, and the way we're going to borrow money is we're going to sell Janet and Steve a bond for $100 that they're going to give Sam for his bar mitzvah. And in 20 years, it'll be worth $100. They paid $75. We're going to give them interest. So basically, they're giving us a loan, the government a loan, and we're going to pay it back with interest in 20 years. And Sam's going to get this like a little bond. Obviously, the bonds are a little bit bigger and they get sold to other people, but that's the dynamic that's going on there. And when the Treasury starts to sell these bonds, they set interest rates on them, and they'll do them at different terms. This will be, $100 in 10 years or 15 years or 20 years. And that impacts how much money is out there, because it allows the government to deficit spend, and that adds a surplus in the private sector. And therefore, it begins to implicate monetary policy that the Feds, it's sort of like the Fed's arena. So it's like Fed's a big bank, but the Treasury is such a big client that they can impact it. Is that it?
Yeah, a little bit. One thing I would say there is that I would separate the selling of the Treasury security from the deficit. So that the selling the Treasury security is will potentially enable them to deficit spend at a later time, or meet payments at a later date, but the selling of the Treasury security itself doesn't affect those balances out there. They sell a Treasury security to the private sector. The private sector say, hands over cash or hands over a bank deposit, whatever it is. That's exchange of one financial asset for another. Nothing happens in terms of deficits or surpluses. It's only later when the federal government goes out and spends that it's running a deficit. And that's important because we can, as I've been writing a lot about recently, we can rearrange these relationships. We can say, this is stupid. Why are we having the Treasury be responsible for it, for issuing this instrument? Because the Federal Reserve should really be in charge of selling bonds, because it's the one that's concerned about interest rates. It's the one that wants to set certain interest rates on a 10-year bond or a 20-year bond. It's the one that was worried about how many 10-year bonds are circulating in the private sector. It's the one that wants to manage all these processes, and what it would do to choose to do that is different than what the Treasury would choose. And while from the Treasury's point of view, it's looking at this as, the national debt that it's using to finance itself. But the Federal Reserve and the financiers that the Federal Reserve interacts with is looking at a Treasury security and saying, this is the safest asset in the world. If I want to put $100 million somewhere and I want to guarantee that I'm not going to lose my money, what I want to do is buy a Treasury security. I can't put it in a bank because the bank has insurance, has deposit insurance caps. So my big option, if I want to make sure that I have $100 million and I'll have $100 million in 20 years, is by buying a bond. And that role of being a safe asset, of being, providing something to investors, is what the Federal Reserve really cares about. And the decisions it would make would be different than the Treasury would make. And in the meantime, as we can talk about in a bit, everyone gets very confused or gets worried about the national debt, and it isn't thinking about it the way the financiers and the central bankers are thinking.
And the reason why I think that my $100 billion is going to be there in 20 years is because the U.S. government has the ability to tax a massive population, essentially, that is highly productive. And that makes it the safest bet in the world. Is that basically it?
And that it's then not only that, but that the federal government will create dollars and absolutely make its payments no matter what. That you can rely on the federal government is going to make its payments, and the money you get at the end of that process is going to be valuable because of the system of payments that are denominated in dollars. There's so many countries around the world that owe dollars, and corporations and banks around the world that owes dollars. There's a huge population within the United States that owes dollars in all these different ways, that you can rely not just that some bureaucrat is going to quote unquote print money and provide you money, but that money is probably going to have still be valuable 10, 20 years down the line.
All right. And lastly, I mean, just this idea, that the people, in the wake of the financial crisis, I remember going on TV with David Stockman, who was the Office of Budget Management Director under Reagan. And he would come on and he would say, PIMCO, which is the biggest bond buyer, I guess, or one of the biggest bond buyers in the country, is selling their bonds, and the by July we're going to have rampant inflation, and I think this was in 2010 or 11, I can't remember when it was, and everything's going to crash, and there's going to be inflation, and people won't want to buy our bonds anymore. And so when you say that, when people like that are worried about stuff, they're not looking at it in the way that investors do, because none of those things happened. I mean, Glenn Beck and there was a whole industry out there telling us that we were going to turn into the Weimar Republic because of quantitative easing and whatnot, which is, and none of that happened. So
yeah, no, the people who bet against Treasury securities lost a lot of money.